Everybody, what's up? All right, so this morning we got fourth quarter GDP. I told you GDP was going to be weak in the fourth quarter. I told you. I was talking about the trade deficit widening out. I was talking about the slowdown in fiscal flows. All right, all that stuff. I was talking about weak retail sales. All that stuff showed up. I mean, we saw the main, first of all, the personal consumption expenditures. That's the biggest component of GDP. Let's just backtrack a little bit. For those of you who are not familiar with GDP, measures the total output of the domestic economy. There's four components in it. The biggest one is personal consumption expenditures. That's what you and me and everybody else spends their money on. The next is domestic private investment. And that is everything that businesses spend their money on. The next is government. Government is also, and it's actually a bigger component than gross private domestic investment. And finally, there is net exports. Net exports is exports minus imports. And because the United States always runs a trade deficit, that's always a negative number. In other words, you have to subtract out the stuff that was produced outside of the United States, and that's reflected in imports. So that's always a drag on GDP. Sometimes it could be a big drag when that number is very negative. Sometimes it could be a little bit less of a drag when it improves, when we have more exports, or exports are growing faster than imports. All right, so let's break it down. Personal consumption expenditures, I think it was up something like 70 billion. That compared to the third quarter was up something like 80 something billion. In the second quarter was up 120 billion. So clearly a slowdown from the second quarter to the third quarter and the third quarter to the fourth quarter. That's bad because that's the biggest component of the economy, what we spend our money on. Gross private domestic investment, that was up a lot. Okay, that was up something like 77 billion or something. And most of that gain, almost 50 billion of that, 48 billion, I think, came from inventory investment. So that's firms building up their inventories again. So they see, or at least they're hopeful, that things are getting better. But remember, those inventories, they can't just sit on the shelves. It's nice that they stocked up, and that contributed to the one positive aspect in the economy in the fourth quarter. But now if the stuff just sits on the shelves, that's going to be a loss, right? Next, government consumption expenditures and investment. What's interesting here is that federal government, that number went down a little bit by 3.3 billion. State and local government, it went up something like 12 point something billion. But remember, the state and the local governments, they can't, they are constrained in how much they could spend because they're not currency issuers. They are dependent on tax revenues, whereas the federal government could spend whatever it wants. It could run deficits. States have to balance their budgets, and they are not currency issuers. All right. So, and by the way, many states for this fiscal year have reduced their budgets and are forecasting slower expenditures. So that number is not going to keep up the way it did. So, and finally, that net exports, that was a big negative, all right? That was like a 70 or plus billion dollar negative. And I told you that was going to happen because I looked at the trade deficit going up. And that's the dollar, man. That's the dollar. The dollar was, as a matter of fact, that decline in net exports, that was the worst. I went all the way back to 2006 on the tables from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and I could not find a number that big. So that might be the biggest quarterly drop in net exports that we have ever witnessed. All right, and that was a big subtraction. On the flip side of that, and some of you have pointed this out to me in the past in your comment, imports were up, so that it does show that there's strong demand. The only problem is we're buying the stuff produced outside of the United States. which is interesting because it shows that Trump's idea to bring that production home, that's a really good idea. If he does that, and I showed you the other day, or I talked about the other day, how we're only using 75% of our industrial capacity. So we have plenty of ability to expand our production at home. So the tariffs, they could work if he actually goes through with that. The economy is definitely fixable, easily fixable. I mean, with what he's proposing to bring that production home, all right, and then spend on infrastructure and then get a tax cut. I mean, you're growing, if he does that stuff, you know, we're growing 5-6% a year. Easy, man, easy. But that, by the way, that doesn't take into account if he does some, the big spending cuts that he wants to do. Again, we don't have enough information. But clearly, the stock market seems way ahead of itself right now if you look at fourth quarter GDP. And yes, I know the flows have reverted back to positive, and that's a good thing for first quarter GDP. We got to look at that banking, the banking data, which will be out later today, and I will include it in the report. So, bottom line is, my forecast actually was more correct. I think I was looking at something like, you know, around the high 1%, 1.8, 1.9. That's where it came in. And, you know, the Fed was looking at 2.8%. All right. So I had everything pretty much down on that one. But anyway, it seems to me the stock market is way ahead. We need more information, which we will get. It's going to take some time, I think, because Trump right now, he's focused on immigration and the wall. By the way, on that wall, let me just say this, because it's like this whole discussion now. Who's going to pay for the war? He promised that Mexico is going to pay for the wall. Just on a personal note, all right, America with walls around it, to me, seems just antithetical for what we stand for. I don't, the picture of America with, you know, walls around it, I just, kind of a turnoff for me. I like Trump and I voted for him, but that whole thing is kind of a turnoff. But anyway, let's say the wall costs $10 billion, all right? $10 billion is 0.2% of how much the government spends every year. That's the same thing, let's say, as a guy who makes $50,000 a year spending $100 to put in a fence in his backyard. I mean, I think if it was expressed that way, people would say, the hell with it. If Mexico doesn't pay, then just build the wall. It's like a guy who makes $50,000 a year spending $100 to put a fence in his backyard. I mean, so what's the big deal? Why are we having this? So if Mexico doesn't pay, they don't pay. So we'll pay for it. And on that note, let me just say one final thing, because Trump exposed the lie about deficits, because he was in an interview with ABC News, this guy David Muir, and he said, look, because I think Muir asked him a question, well, what about the deficit? He's like, the military is too important to worry about the deficit. So, it's a question of priorities. You could take that word out, military, and you could substitute healthcare, infrastructure, education, basic science and research. Anything you want, you could substitute in there in the place of military, and it would read the same way, that that thing is priority enough to run deficits. So it's a question of priorities. In the United States, we like military and we like war. So we say, hey, it's okay to run deficits for that. But when it comes to the other thing, healthcare, education, infrastructure, alternative energy, basic science and research, all that stuff, we say, no, we can't do that. We don't have the money. So Trump unwittingly exposed the hypocrisy of the whole entire thing. We pay no matter how much it is. There's always money for military and war, but there's never money for the other stuff. That's the way it is. Bye.